Something was wrong long before anyone opened that door. It started with something small, missed calls, messages left unanswered, the kind of silence that doesn't make sense, especially not for someone like Travis Alexander. He wasn't the type to disappear. He was active, social, always connected. The kind of man who showed up, the kind of man people could reach. But now, nothing. Days had passed. At first, no one panicked. Maybe he was traveling. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he just needed space. But the silence didn't feel normal. It lingered, it stretched, and slowly it turned into something heavier. Something that sat in the chest and refused to go away. On June 9th, 2008, concern became action. A small group of friends stood outside his home in Mesa, Arizona. There was hesitation, that quiet, unspoken fear that maybe they were about to confirm something they didn't want to believe. Still, they knocked. No answer. They tried again. Nothing. The house felt wrong even from the outside. Still, too still. Eventually, they found a way in. The moment the door opened, the air shifted. It wasn't just quiet inside. It was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding on to something that didn't belong. Step by step, they moved through the house. Careful, uneasy. And then they saw it, a dark stain on the floor. Then another, and another. Blood. Not a drop, not a smear. A trail. Panic set in instantly. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something you could explain away. Their breathing changed. Their pace quickened. And without needing to say a word, they followed it down the hallway to the bathroom, each step heavier than the last. And then they reached it. The door, slightly open. Inside, the nightmare was waiting. There, in the shower, lay Travis Alexander, motionless, broken, gone. What they were looking at didn't make sense, not in any normal way. The level of violence, the brutality, it wasn't random. It wasn't quick. It wasn't something that just happened. This was personal, deeply personal. Whoever did this didn't just want him dead. They wanted to destroy him. Police would later confirm the horror in full detail. Multiple stab wounds, a slashed throat, a gunshot. But in that moment, none of that mattered yet. Because one question had already taken over everything. Who could do something like this? And almost immediately, one name began to surface. Not from evidence, not from proof, but from memory, from behavior, from things that, at the time, didn't seem serious enough. Jodi Arias, the ex-girlfriend who never really went away. The one who still showed up, still called, still lingered in his life, even after it was supposed to be over. At first, it was just a feeling. But sometimes, that's where the truth begins. Because what happened inside that bathroom on June 4th wasn't the result of a single moment. It was the end of something that had been building for a long time. Something complicated. Something intense. Something dangerous. And to understand how it all led here, you have to go back to the beginning. Before the silence, before the blood, before everything fell apart, before the headlines, before the courtroom, before his name became tied to something so dark. Travis Alexander was just a man trying to build a life. And for a long time, that life was far from easy. He was born on July 28, 1977, in Riverside, California, but stability was never guaranteed. By the time he was 8 years old, everything had already begun to shift. His childhood, marked by instability and struggle, eventually led him and his siblings into the care of their grandparents. It wasn't just a change of home. It was a change of direction. People who knew Travis back then described a different version of him. Someone who got into fights, someone who carried anger, someone still trying to find his place in a world that hadn't been kind to him. But what makes his story compelling isn't where he started. It's how hard he tried to change. At some point, something shifted inside him. He found structure, discipline, faith. He became deeply involved with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And for Travis, this wasn't just religion. It was identity. It was purpose. It was a way to redefine who he was and who he wanted to become. And he leaned into it completely. He became a motivational speaker, a salesman, a man driven by goals, by self-improvement, by the idea that no matter where you came from, you could build something better. Through his work with a company called Prepaid Legal Services, he began to grow not only professionally, but socially. People were drawn to him. He was charismatic, confident, engaging, the kind of person who could walk into a room and leave an impression. But like many people who seemed strong on the outside, there were layers beneath that not everyone could see. Travis wanted success. He wanted love. He wanted a future that looked nothing like his past. And for a while, it seemed like he was on the right path. His life was moving forward. His circle was expanding. Opportunities were opening. Everything appeared to be aligning. But there was something else about Travis that would later become important. Something that didn't quite fit the clean image he projected. His relationships. They weren't always simple. They weren't always stable. And sometimes they blurred lines that should have stayed clear. Friends would later say that he could be charming, but also complicated. That he didn't always handle emotional connections the way people expected. And maybe that's where the cracks began. Because long before anything violent happened, long before fear entered the picture, there was a relationship forming in his life that would slowly begin to change everything. At first, it didn't seem dangerous. At first, it didn't seem unusual. It just seemed like two people meeting at the right time. But sometimes, the most dangerous stories don't start with warning signs. They start with chemistry, with attention, with connection. And in September of 2006, during what should have been just another business conference in Las Vegas, Jodi Arias walked into his life. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Some meetings feel ordinary in the moment, almost forgettable. And yet, they end up changing everything. In September of 2006, at a business conference in Las Vegas, Travis Alexander met Jodi Arias for the first time. It wasn't a dramatic encounter, no immediate warning signs, no visible tension, just two people brought together by work, by opportunity, by chance. At least, that's how it seemed. Jodi wasn't out of place there. She was working in sales, trying to build something for herself, just like everyone else in that room. She had ambitions. She had interests. She was an aspiring photographer, someone searching for direction, for purpose, for something that felt stable. And Travis, he was exactly the kind of person who could offer that. Confident, driven, charismatic. He stood out. People noticed him. And Jodi did too. What started as a simple interaction quickly became something more. There was attention, curiosity, a growing connection that on the surface looked natural, easy, the kind of beginning that doesn't raise questions. But what no one could see at the time was how quickly things were about to intensify. Because this wasn't going to be a slow, steady relationship. It moved faster than most people would expect. Within weeks, Jodi began immersing herself into Travis's world, not just socially, but personally, deeply. And one of the most significant shifts came when she made a decision that to outsiders might have seemed like devotion. She converted. Jodi was baptized into the same church Travis belonged to. And more than that, he was the one who performed the baptism. That moment mattered. Not just symbolically, but psychologically, because it created a bond that went beyond attraction, beyond dating. It tied them together through belief, through identity, through something much harder to separate from. And soon after, they officially became a couple. By February of 2007, they were in a relationship. At first, everything seemed intense, but not necessarily unhealthy. They talked constantly. They spent time together whenever they could. And even when distance became a factor, they found ways to stay connected. But intensity can be misleading. What feels like passion in the beginning can slowly turn into something else. Something heavier. Something harder to control. Their relationship didn't follow a stable pattern. It wasn't consistent. It wasn't predictable. It was on and off. Close and distant. Emotional highs followed by sudden drops. And yet, no matter how many times things seemed to fall apart, they kept going back to each other. Even when Travis dated other people, the connection with Jodi didn't fully disappear. It lingered. It pulled them back in. Messages continued. Conversations that crossed boundaries. A dynamic that from the outside started to look complicated, unstable. And for those who were close to Travis, something didn't feel right. Friends began to notice it. Not immediately, but over time. There was something about Jodi's presence, something about the way she stayed in his life, that didn't seem normal. It wasn't just attachment, it felt persistent, almost like she wasn't willing to let go. And maybe she wasn't, because what was forming between them wasn't just a relationship. It was something much more tangled, more intense, more dangerous. And while Travis may have believed he could manage it, control it, keep it within limits, he was already in deeper than he realized. Because sometimes the moment you think you're in control is the moment you've already lost it. At first, it looked like passion, the kind of connection people envy. Intense conversations, constant contact, a chemistry that didn't seem to fade, no matter how many times things went wrong. But behind that intensity, something else was growing, something far less visible and far more dangerous. The relationship between Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias was never stable. It didn't follow a normal rhythm. There were no clear boundaries, no clean endings, just a cycle repeating itself over and over again. They would get close, then pull apart, break up, then reconnect. Say goodbye, then start talking again like nothing had happened. And with each cycle, the emotional intensity only seemed to grow stronger. From the outside, it was confusing. Friends of Travis began to notice that something wasn't right. The relationship didn't just seem complicated, it felt chaotic, unpredictable. And more than that, it felt unhealthy. There were arguments, tension, moments where things didn't make sense. But even then, he didn't fully walk away. And neither did she, because despite everything, they stayed connected. Even when Travis started seeing other women, the communication with Jodi never completely stopped. Messages continued, conversations turned intimate. Boundaries blurred in ways that made it impossible for either of them to truly move on. It was no longer just a relationship. It was a loop. And inside that loop, things began to shift. Jodi didn't just stay in Travis's life. She moved closer to it. At one point, she relocated to Mesa, Arizona, the same city where he lived. On the surface, it could be explained as a practical decision. Work, opportunity, a fresh start. But for those who were watching from the outside, it felt like something else. Like she was closing the distance intentionally. Like she needed to be near him. And even when she later moved back to California, that connection didn't weaken. If anything, it became more intense, more obsessive. Friends would later describe her behavior as concerning, not just because she remained present, but because of how she remained present. There were moments where she appeared uninvited, times where she seemed to know things she shouldn't know, times where the line between staying connected and not letting go became almost impossible to distinguish. And Travis knew it. He started to express concern. To people close to him, he described the situation in ways that no longer sounded like a normal breakup. Words like stressful, complicated, began to turn into something stronger, something more serious. He told friends that she wouldn't leave him alone, that she kept finding ways to stay involved in his life, that no matter what he did, the connection never truly ended. At some point, what once felt like passion started to feel like pressure and maybe even fear. But even then, he didn't fully cut it off, because relationships like this don't break cleanly. They stretch, they twist, they pull people back in even when they know they shouldn't return. And by the time Travis realized just how far things had gone, it may have already been too late. Because what was building between them wasn't just emotional anymore. It was something deeper, something unstable, something that was slowly, quietly moving toward a breaking point. And when that breaking point finally came, it wouldn't be subtle. It would be controlled. It would be sudden, violent, and impossible to take back. Long before the violence, there were signs. Not obvious at first, not the kind that immediately make people step in, but subtle changes, small behaviors, moments that didn't quite fit. The kind of things that are easy to dismiss in the moment and impossible to ignore later. For Travis Alexander, those signs were already becoming part of his daily life. What once felt like intensity now felt different. He began to notice patterns, unexpected appearances, conversations that didn't end when they should have, a presence that lingered even when he tried to create distance. And while none of it on its own seemed extreme, together it painted a picture that was becoming harder to ignore. Jodi Arias wasn't just someone from his past. She was still there, constantly. Friends started to see it too. They noticed how often her name came up, how often she was still involved in his life, even after the relationship was supposed to be over. And more than that, they noticed how it affected him. There was tension, frustration, at times even unease. Some would later say that the relationship didn't just seem unhealthy, it seemed volatile, as if something underneath it all was building slowly, quietly, waiting for the moment it would surface. There were stories, things Travis shared in private conversations, incidents that at the time may have sounded exaggerated or difficult to fully understand, but they stayed in people's minds. He told friends that she had access to his personal accounts, that she would read his messages, that she seemed to know details about his life that he never shared with her. There were even claims that went further, that she had shown up uninvited, that she had interfered in his personal space, that she had crossed lines most people wouldn't even consider approaching. And still, nothing definitive, no confrontation that ended it. No clean break. Just a growing sense that something wasn't right. And yet, life kept moving. Plans were still being made. Trips were being organized, including one that would later become significant. A work-related trip to Cancun, scheduled for mid-June of 2008. At one point, Travis had mentioned that Jodi Arias would be joining him. But then, something changed. He decided to go with someone else. To outsiders, it may have seemed like a simple decision, a change of plans, nothing more. But in a relationship already filled with tension, decisions like that don't exist in isolation. They carry weight. They send messages. And sometimes they trigger reactions. Around that same time, another event took place. One that, at first glance, seemed unrelated. A reported break-in at the home where Jodi was staying in California. Items were missing, including something that would later raise serious questions. A firearm, a small caliber weapon, one that, at the time, was simply listed as stolen, gone, unaccounted for. But later, when investigators began to piece everything together, that detail would come back. And it wouldn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Because the closer the timeline moved toward June 4th, the more the pieces started to align. Conversations became more frequent. Calls during the early hours of the morning. Contact that felt urgent, almost desperate, as if something was building beneath the surface. Something that hadn't yet been seen, but was already in motion. And when everything finally came together, it wouldn't look like a series of random events. It would look like a path, one that had been forming for a long time, leading, step by step, to a single moment. A moment that would change everything. If you look at what happened next, it doesn't feel random. It feels constructed. Step by step, detail by detail, a timeline begins to emerge. And once you see it clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore how everything seems to connect. In the early hours of June 2nd, 2008, something unusual happened. Between approximately 1 in the morning and 3 in the morning, Jodi Arias made multiple calls to Travis Alexander. 4 calls, none of them substantial, the longest lasting only seconds. It was as if she was trying to reach him, but not really speaking. Then something changed. After 3 in the morning, Travis called her back. Not once, but twice. The first call lasted around 18 minutes. The second, over 40 minutes. Long conversations. Late at night. And then one more call. Just after 4 in the morning, she called him again. Short, brief. And after that, silence. Whatever was said during those calls was never presented in court. No recordings, no transcripts, just a gap. A missing piece in a timeline filled with details. But only hours later, movement begins. At approximately 5:39 in the morning, Jodi left. A long drive ahead. A trip that on paper had nothing to do with Travis. She was heading toward Utah. A work-related conference. A normal reason. A normal explanation. But the way she prepared for that trip would later raise questions. She rented a car. Not locally, but in another city, and she indicated that she would return it there as well. A round trip. Planned. Documented. Along the way, she made stops, visited friends, maintained appearances. Everything about her behavior suggested normalcy, routine. Nothing out of place. The timelines don't lie. And as investigators would later discover, there was a window, a gap, a period of time where her exact movements became harder to verify. And that window leads directly to June 4th, the day everything changed. Because while she continued her trip, while she moved forward as if nothing was wrong, Travis Alexander stopped responding. He missed an important call, a scheduled commitment, something people expected him to attend. And when it didn't show up, it was noticed, but not immediately understood, because at that point, no one knew what had already happened. No one knew what had taken place inside that house, inside that bathroom. No one knew, that the timeline they were beginning to question was already leading them straight to a crime scene. And while Jodi continued her journey, meeting people, talking normally, blending into everyday life, something about her had changed, subtle, but noticeable. The next day when she met a colleague, there were details that didn't quite fit. Her hair, different, darker. Her hands, marked, small cuts. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately raise alarm, but enough to be remembered later. Because when you look back on moments like that, after you know the full story, they don't feel small anymore. They feel like evidence, pieces of something much larger. Because while everyone else was still trying to understand why Travis had gone silent, the truth was already unfolding, quietly, step by step, hidden inside a timeline that, once revealed, would change everything. June 4th, 2008, didn't begin like a day that would end in violence. There were no alarms, no warnings, nothing that would make anyone believe that within a few hours, everything would be over for Travis Alexander. At some point that afternoon, he wasn't alone. Inside his home in Mesa, Arizona, someone else was there. Someone he knew. Someone he had let in. Because there were no signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no struggle at the entrance. Whoever entered that house wasn't a stranger. They were welcome, or at least trusted enough to be there. And at first, nothing seemed unusual. In fact, there is evidence that suggests the exact opposite. Moments that on the surface appeared calm, normal, almost intimate, because inside that house, a camera was being used. Photos were taken, not by accident, not randomly, but intentionally. Images that would later be recovered, even after someone tried to erase them. Photos showing Jodi Arias and Travis together. Close, comfortable, engaged in moments that suggested there was no immediate conflict, no visible tension, no sign of what was about to happen. Time passed. Hours moved forward. And then something shifted. The last known image of Travis alive captures him standing in the shower. Unaware, vulnerable, seconds away from what would become the final moments of his life. What happened next didn't unfold in a single instant. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It was chaotic, violent, overwhelming. Investigators would later determine that Travis suffered multiple stab wounds, dozens, defensive injuries on his hands, suggesting he tried to fight back, tried to protect himself. At some point, his throat was cut, severely. And then, a gunshot. But even that detail raised questions, because the sequence of events wasn't entirely clear. Was a gunshot first? or last? Was he already dying or already gone? Those answers would remain uncertain. But one thing was not, this wasn't self-defense in any simple sense. This was overkill, a level of violence that went beyond stopping a threat. It suggested emotion, intensity, something personal, because this wasn't just about ending a life. It was about destruction, total, uncontrolled. And when it was over, silence returned to the house, but not the same silence as before. This one was different, heavier, permanent. And inside that silence, something else happened. Something that would later shock investigators even more than the crime itself. The camera, instead of being discarded, it was placed inside a washing machine, submerged, as if someone had tried to erase everything, to destroy the evidence, to make sure nothing remained. But that didn't work, because even after being damaged, the truth was still there, hidden, waiting to be recovered. And once it was, the story would change completely, because those images didn't just show what happened before the attack. They placed someone at the scene, at the exact time everything unfolded. Someone who, up until that point, had not told the truth. And from that moment on, the investigation would no longer be about what happened. It would be about proving it and confronting the person who had been there when it all ended. Some crimes leave behind chaos. Others leave behind silence. But this one left behind something far more dangerous: proof. When investigators searched the home of Travis Alexander, they were already dealing with a brutal scene. Blood, violence, a level of aggression that clearly told them this wasn't random, this wasn't a burglary, this wasn't chance. This was intentional, but even with all that, they still needed something concrete, something that could place a person there at that exact moment. And then they found it. A camera, recently purchased, damaged, hidden inside a washing machine. At first glance, it looked like an attempt to destroy evidence, a desperate move, something done in a hurry. The kind of mistake someone makes when they believe panic will erase what really happened. But technology doesn't forget so easily. The camera was recovered, analyzed, and what investigators found inside changed everything. Deleted photos, hundreds of them, but not gone, just hidden. Recovered piece by piece, image by image. The timeline of that day began to come back to life. And what those photos revealed was disturbing, because they didn't start with violence. They started with normality. Images of Jodi Arias and Travis together, relaxed, close, comfortable. Moments that suggested there was no immediate threat, no visible fear, no sign that anything was about to go wrong. But then, the sequence continued, timestamp, precise, leading directly to the final moments. The last known image of Travis alive, standing in the shower. Seconds later, everything changes. The next photos weren't normal. They weren't calm. They showed a body on the floor, bleeding, broken. The violence captured frame by frame. It wasn't just evidence. It was a timeline, a visual record of what happened in real time. And suddenly, the investigation shifted, because this wasn't about speculation anymore. This wasn't about guessing. This was about confirmation. Someone had been there, someone had taken those photos. Someone had tried to delete them. And that someone was now directly connected to the most critical moment of the crime. But the evidence didn't stop there. Inside the house, investigators found something else. A bloody palm print. On the wall. Clear. Defined. Containing DNA from two people. Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias. At that point, the case was no longer uncertain. It was focused, direct, and closing in. Because now, they didn't just have suspicion. They had presence. They had physical evidence. They had a timeline. And they had someone who, up until then, had told a very different story. A story that didn't place her there. A story that didn't match the evidence. A story that was about to fall apart. Because when confronted with facts like these, there are only two options. Tell the truth or change the story. And very soon, that's exactly what would happen. When the evidence starts to speak, silence is no longer an option. By the time investigators connected the camera, the photos, and the DNA, the focus had already shifted toward Jodi Arias. But at that moment, she wasn't acting like someone hiding a crime. She was talking, calmly, confidently, and telling a story that at first seemed simple. She said she hadn't been there. According to her, the last time she saw Travis Alexander was months before his death, March 2008. That was her version. Clear, direct, no hesitation. And for a brief moment, that story held. Because without the full picture, without the recovered evidence, it was just her word against an unanswered timeline. But that didn't last. Because investigators already knew something she didn't expect. They had proof, not assumptions, not theories. Proof that placed her inside that house on the day of the murder. And when that evidence was brought forward, her story changed. Not slightly, completely. Now, she admitted she had been there. But what happened next wasn't her fault. According to this new version, two intruders had entered the house. Masked. Dangerous. Unpredictable. She claimed they attacked both of them. That they killed Travis and then turned on her. That she barely survived. That she escaped. It was a dramatic story. Violent, chaotic. There was a problem. None of the physical evidence supported it. No signs of forced entry. No unidentified DNA. No trace of anyone else being there. Nothing. And once again, the story didn't hold, so it changed for the third time. Now, the truth, according to her, was different. She admitted she killed him, but not as an attacker, as a victim. Self-defense. She claimed that Travis Alexander had become violent, that he attacked her, that she feared for her life, that everything that happened inside that bathroom was a reaction, a desperate attempt to survive. 3 stories, 3 completely different versions, and each one further from the evidence than the last. For investigators, this wasn't confusion. It was a pattern, because when someone tells the truth, the story stays the same. But when someone is trying to escape it, the story adapts. It shifts. It breaks under pressure. And that's exactly what was happening. Every time she was confronted, the narrative moved, adjusted, rebuilt. But the evidence didn't move. The photos didn't change. The DNA didn't disappear. The timeline remained exactly where it was. And slowly, piece by piece, the gap between her words and reality became impossible to ignore, because this was no longer just about what happened inside that house. It was about why the person who was there couldn't tell the same story twice. And as the investigation continued, that inconsistency will become one of the most damaging elements of the entire case. Because in the end, it's not just the crime that reveals the truth. It is what happens after. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the story was already everywhere. What happened inside that house was no longer just a police investigation. It had become something bigger, something public, something people were watching closely, forming opinions, choosing sides. And at the center of it all sat Jodi Arias. The trial officially began in early January 2013 inside a courtroom in Arizona. But long before the first witness spoke, the tone had already been set. This wasn't going to be a simple case. It was going to be a battle. On one side, the prosecution. Their argument was direct, clear. They claimed that what happened to Travis Alexander was not an accident, not a reaction, not self-defense. It was planned, premeditated. They described Jodi as someone driven by jealousy, someone who couldn't accept rejection, someone who made a decision and followed through with it in the most violent way possible. They pointed to the timeline, the rental car, the gasoline purchase, the missing weapon, the attempt to destroy the camera, every detail, building a picture of intention, control, preparation, and then execution. But on the other side, the defense told a completely different story. They didn't deny that she was there. They didn't deny that she killed him, but they argued something else entirely. That she was a victim, that the relationship had been abusive, that behind closed doors, Travis Alexander was not the person everyone believed him to be. According to them, he was controlling, aggressive, capable of violence. And on that day, they said, he attacked her. What happened next was survival, not murder, self-defense. Two completely opposite versions of the same event. And now it was up to a jury to decide which one was real. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became more than just a place for evidence. It became a stage. Every detail was examined, every statement questioned, every piece of evidence presented and challenged. Witnesses took the stand. Experts gave their opinions. Friends, colleagues, people who knew Travis described him as kind, driven, nonviolent. But the defense pushed back. They brought forward their own witnesses, psychologists, specialists, people who suggested that Jodi had been under extreme stress, that her mind may have entered a state of survival, fight or flight, that her memory may not even be complete. And then something happened that changed the dynamic of the entire trial. She took the stand. Jodi Arias decided to testify in her own defense. For days, then weeks, she spoke in detail about her past, her childhood, her relationship with Travis. She described abuse, fear, moments where she claimed she felt trapped, controlled, powerless. But with every word she spoke, something else began to happen. The longer she talked, the more questions appeared, because her testimony didn't just tell a story. It introduced new details, new claims, new inconsistencies, and the prosecution was waiting for that. watching, listening, because when the time came for cross-examination, they weren't just going to challenge her story. They were going to break it apart, piece by piece. And once that process began, there would be no way to go back. Because in a case like this, it's not enough to tell a story. You have to make people believe it. And that was about to become her biggest problem. At some point in a trial like this, everything comes down to one moment. Not the evidence, not the experts, but the person at the center of it all, facing the truth under pressure. When Jodi Arias took the stand, it wasn't just another phase of the trial. It became the moment everyone was waiting for. The moment where her version of events would finally be tested in front of the jury in real time. And at first, she appeared composed, calm, controlled. She spoke slowly, carefully, choosing her words, describing her past, her childhood, her relationship with Travis Alexander in a way that painted a very specific picture. A picture where she wasn't the aggressor. She was the victim. She described abuse, emotional, physical, psychological. She told the jury that the relationship had become unbearable, that she lived in fear, that on the day of the incident, everything escalated beyond control. According to her, it started with something small, a camera. She claimed she dropped it, that it triggered his anger, that he snapped, that he came toward her violently. And in that moment, she said she believed she was going to die. So she fought back. That was her explanation. That was her justification. But then came the cross-examination, and everything changed because the prosecution wasn't there to listen. They were there to confront, to challenge every detail, every inconsistency, every version she had ever told. And they started with something simple. Her own words, the different stories she had given over time. First, she wasn't there. Then, intruders. Now, self-defense. 3 versions, all coming from the same person. And one by one, those contradictions were placed in front of her, repeated, forced into the open. And under that pressure, her composure began to shift, subtle at first, then more noticeable. Because it's one thing to tell a story. It's another to defend it when every piece of evidence points in a different direction. The prosecutor pressed harder. Details about the timeline, about the injuries, about the level of violence, about the fact that Travis Alexander had defensive wounds, suggesting he was trying to protect himself, about the sheer number of attacks, because self-defense doesn't usually look like that. It doesn't continue, it doesn't escalate, it doesn't end with that level of destruction. And then the questions became sharper, more direct, more difficult to answer. Why take the camera? Why try to delete the photos? Why wash it? Why change your story? Again and again and again. At times, she pushed back. At times, she deflected. At times, she appeared frustrated, even confrontational. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became. This wasn't helping her. It was hurting her, because every answer seemed to raise another question. Every explanation created another doubt, and the jury was watching all of it. Not just what she said, but how she said it, how she reacted, how she handled pressure. Because in a courtroom, credibility is everything. And once that starts to break, it's almost impossible to rebuild. By the time her testimony ended, it had lasted an extraordinary amount of time. Days turned into weeks. One of the longest testimonies in a case like this. But length doesn't equal strength. And according to many who are there, it didn't make her case stronger. It made it weaker, because instead of clarifying the truth, it exposed how unstable her story really was. And once the jury saw that, everything else became easier to understand. Because now, it wasn't just about what happened that day. It was about whether they believed her. And that belief was already starting to slip away. After weeks of testimony, hours of arguments, and a story pulled in completely different directions, everything came down to one final moment. The jury disappeared behind closed doors. No cameras, no voices, just 12 people and one decision that would define everything. For Jodi Arias, this was it. For the family of Travis Alexander, this was justice or the absence of it. Time moved differently during deliberation. Every hour felt longer. Every minute heavier. Because inside that room, they weren't just reviewing evidence. They were deciding what was true. Was it premeditated murder or a desperate act of self-defense? Two versions. Only one could survive. They went through everything. The photos, the timeline, the injuries, the contradictions, the testimony. Again and again and again. And slowly, a conclusion began to form. On May 7th, 2013, after approximately 15 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom filled with silence, tension so thick it felt impossible to breathe. Everyone stood still, waiting, watching. And then the verdict was read. Guilty. Not just of murder, but of first-degree murder, premeditated, deliberate, intentional. All 12 jurors agreed. There was no doubt, no hesitation. For them, this wasn't self-defense. This was a calculated act. In that moment, everything changed. The narrative that had been presented by the defense collapsed. The idea of a spontaneous reaction disappeared, because the jury had made it clear this was planned. As the words settled into the room, emotions broke through the silence. Members of Travis's family embraced. Relief, grief, a mixture of both. Outside the courthouse, reactions spread instantly. People who had followed the case, watched every detail, responded in real time. Because by now, this wasn't just a trial. It was a national story. And now, it had an answer, but not a conclusion. Because even though the verdict had been reached, the most important question was still unresolved. What would the punishment be? Life or death? That decision would come next. And unlike the verdict, it wouldn't be simple, because what followed would divide the jury, push them to their limits, and reveal just how heavy that final choice really was. A guilty verdict answers one question, but it raises another. And sometimes that second question is even harder. After being convicted of the murder of Travis Alexander, the focus shifted immediately. The courtroom wasn't finished. The case wasn't over, because now the jury had to decide something far more final. Punishment. Life in prison or death. This phase wasn't about what happened anymore. It was about how much it mattered, about how the law would respond to the level of violence they had just confirmed. And once again, the jury was asked to look at everything. But this time, through a different lens. The prosecution argued that the crime wasn't just murder. It's cruel. It was excessive. They brought attention to the suffering, to the number of wounds, to the time it may have taken for Travis Alexander to die. They described the fear, the pain, the reality of what he experienced in those final moments. Because to them, this wasn't just about ending a life. It was about how that life was taken, and they wanted the maximum penalty: death. But the defense, once again, told a different story. They didn't try to undo the verdict. They couldn't. Instead, they tried to humanize Jodi Arias. They talked about her past, her trauma, her mental state. They argued that despite everything, she didn't deserve to die. And then something unexpected happened. She spoke. Directly, not as a witness, but as a person facing the consequences of everything. She stood there and asked for her life. Not long before, she had said the opposite, that she would prefer death. But now, her tone had changed. She said she wanted to live, that she wanted the chance to do something meaningful, even from prison. She spoke about her family, about pain, about perspective. And for a moment, the room shifted. Because no matter what people believed, this was still a human life, asking to continue. The jury listened. They returned to deliberation. And just like before, the weight of the decision settled in. But this time, something was different. They couldn't agree. Not completely. The votes were divided. Some believed death was justified. Others didn't. And without a unanimous decision, there was no final answer. A deadlock. After everything, after the evidence, after the conviction, they couldn't reach a conclusion. The judge had no choice. A mistrial was declared for the sentencing phase. The decision postponed. The outcome still uncertain. And for the people involved, that meant something difficult. More waiting, more tension, more time without closure. Because the question of life or death had not been resolved, and until it was, this case was now over. Some cases fade away after the verdict. This one refused to end. Even after the conviction, even after the jury confirmed that Jodi Arias had deliberately killed Travis Alexander, the final chapter was still missing. Because the question that remained was the most definitive of all. How would she spend the rest of her life? After the deadlock in the first sentencing phase, the process had to begin again. A new jury, a new round of arguments, the same evidence, but now with one purpose: to decide between life and death. The retrial began in late 2014. And once again, the courtroom filled with tension. The prosecution stood firm. They repeated their position, the brutality of the crime, the suffering, the number of wounds, the level of control involved. To them, nothing had changed. This was still a case that deserved the ultimate punishment: death. But the defense continued in the same direction. They focused on her humanity, on her mental state, on the argument that even someone guilty of a terrible crime should not be executed. And it's just like before, the jury listened, they reviewed, they debated. But history repeated itself. After long hours of deliberation, they reached another impasse. Again, no unanimous decision. This time, the division was even more striking. Almost all jurors leaned toward the death penalty. All except one. One voice standing against the rest. And that was enough, because without unanimity, the death sentence could not be imposed. The judge now had the responsibility. The final decision was no longer in the hands of a jury. It was in the hands of the court. On April 13, 2015, the sentence was finally delivered. Jodi Arias would spend the rest of her life in prison. No possibility of parole. No second chance. No release. A life sentence. For some, it was justice. For others, it wasn't enough. But for the legal system, it was final. The long process, the years of investigation, testimony, argument, all of it led to that moment. And with that decision, the courtroom chapter of this case came to an end. But the story itself didn't disappear, because what happened between Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander would continue to be discussed, analyzed, questioned. Not just because of the crime, but because of everything surrounding it. The relationship, the lies, the evidence, the spectacle, and the question that still lingers in cases like this, not just what happened, but why some crimes end in silence. This one turned into noise, relentless, loud, impossible to ignore. Long after the sentence was delivered, after Jodi Arias was taken away to spend the rest of her life in prison, the story refused to fade. Because this case didn't just live in courtrooms, it lived on screens, on headlines, in conversations. What happened to Travis Alexander became more than a tragedy. It became a spectacle, one that millions of people followed day after day, detail after detail, as if it were unfolding in real time. The trial was broadcast, watched, replayed, analyzed from every possible angle. And something unusual began to happen. People didn't just observe the case. They became part of it. They formed opinions. They chose sides. They debated every testimony, every contradiction, every piece of evidence. Some believed the verdict was undeniable. Others questioned it. Some saw a manipulator. Others saw someone damaged. But regardless of perspective, one thing was clear. No one was indifferent. The courtroom turned into a stage. The witnesses into characters. The lawyers into opposing forces in a narrative that felt almost unreal. And at the center of it all, a story built on obsession, control, rejection, and a relationship that never truly made sense, even to those who watched it closely. Media coverage intensified everything. Every reaction amplified. Every moment dissected. What should have remained a case of justice became something closer to entertainment for many. And that raises a question that lingers long after the facts are known. At what point does justice become spectacle? Because behind all the attention, behind the headlines, behind the debates, there was still a man who lost his life. A family that never got him back. And the truth that no matter how much it was analyzed, could never be undone. Today, Jodi Arias remains incarcerated, serving a sentence that ensures she will never walk free again. And Travis Alexander remains the center of a story that continues to echo. Not just because of how it ended, but because of everything that led to it. The warning signs, the contradictions, the moments that, in hindsight, seem impossible to ignore. And maybe that's why this case still holds attention, because it forces a realization that sometimes the most dangerous situations don't begin with violence. They begin quietly, with emotion, with attachment, with something that at first doesn't seem dangerous at all, until it is. And when it finally reveals itself, it's already too late.